Welcome to Bold Agendas, the podcast where we explore topics of strategic interest to business leaders who are guiding their organizations through transformative change. We're entering a moment in enterprise history that feels quiet on the surface, but structurally profound. There are no sweeping declarations that AI has taken over, no obvious loss of control, yet something subtler is happening. A workflow is automated, a decision threshold is embedded, an agent is introduced to triage requests, a reasoning layer supports frontline operations. Each step feels pragmatic, but taken together, they mark a shift leadership has not fully metabolized. For the first time, organizations are not just using software to inform decisions, they're delegating decisions themselves. And when decision and execution collapse, when logic moves at machine speed, governance changes. Oversight that arrives after action is no longer oversight, it's retrospection. What erodes first is not accuracy, and it's not performance, and it's not compliance, it's coherence. Leaders can see what systems are doing, but no one fully can explain why. Decision logic spreads across prompts and thresholds, workflows and agents, each locally rational, but collectively opaque. Nothing is technically broken, but confidence begins to slip. And that's where this conversation begins, because the question facing leaders is no longer which AI tools should we allow, but rather where does our decision logic live and who governs it? Today's episode is all about control, not as a slogan or a checkbox, but as the structural ability to intervene before decisions become actions. Only a few people I know are thinking about that more rigorously than Michael Carroll. Mike Carroll is focused on causality, not prediction, not dashboards, but the reasoning layer that connects evidence to action. In energy and industrial environments where latency carries real consequence, he's been achieving a conversation about causal AI and the architecture of permission. Not prediction for dashboards, but reasoning that connects evidence to action. His work centers on 4 questions. What's happening? Why is it happening? What should be done next? And who has the permission to do it? And how we approve that it was all the right call. As agentic systems begin shaping outcomes in real time, these questions move from technical design to leadership responsibility. I'm Mimi Brooks, and this is Bold Agendas on control at machine speed. Let's get started. This is a big topic. I was thinking, as I've been busy doing like a bunch of board materials and stuff for the last few weeks, which kind of makes you think in a weird way, when you think about it, like talking to the board continually for too long is a little weird. But so when I started, reconnecting with the topic, I'm thinking, this is probably the thread that's connected our discussions for a long time. Everything kind of associated with this big idea of, governance and control. Like, it's a big topic, right? It's a big topic.
And honestly, nobody's figured it out.
I know.
I was in a COO council meeting last week. Everybody admits what the problem is. Nobody has in Israel, they call it chutzpah, right? And everybody knows that we have an architecture problem, and an architecture built for yesterday, right? And so the speed, and you know this, we talk about it all the time, the speed to things that happen today, maybe it's not speed, it's just the closeness, right? That's been created through the application of technology and the architecture wasn't built for that. And because of that, we've created these instances where everything in our lives and everything in our companies goes through constant litigation as to what does it mean? And it's this thinning of our lives that we're going to get into this conversation because you're probably going to ask is AI really removing work? And it depends how you want to think about it. In one sense, you could say it has the potential for enormous help. On the other side, it has the potential for enormous destruction, both societal and personal. And so it's an asymmetric technology. It's asymmetric in the sense that if you call a guy by the name of Nathan Barr that is a professor at Sinclair College in Toronto, he'll tell you that there's a bunch of work out there and studies that he's been a part of that says that artificial intelligence, if you're a novice, it's already better than you are. If you're an expert and you apply it in those domains and use it, it can make you better. If you're a little better than an expert and you apply it, it can make you asymmetrically better than the expert that uses it. And if you're a novice and you use it, because it's better than you are, you're better collectively. But if you're a master and you use AI, then you're asymmetrically better than everybody else. So it's exponentially. It's not the leveler. It separates everybody. But here's the strange part. That the people that are using this stuff that are the most talented aren't working less. They're working more. And so what they'll find out, instead of it saving them time, is because they're now so very productive, they work massive amounts because they're able to get so much done. And I work with a lot of folks on the West Coast too. And the way we work is so different than the way we used to work. And you get so much done. It's like you never stop working because the tools are so powerful. You get so much done in the time, and everybody has the same comment. I need to figure out how to do this differently because the strain is starting to show in my relationships. So we as humans have not figured this out. It's this addiction that may be worse than picking this thing up and looking at it all the time. We're just not used to it.
Yeah. I mean, that's been the case for a long time, right, Mike? That technology would, enable us all to be on the beach at 1:00, and it never happened. I mean, not until COVID, the idea of remote work obviously became, mainstay. Aside from that, though, the idea of saving human hours so that we could spend more of our time on other alternative creative pursuits, societal pursuits, whatever your interests might be, relationships, etc. That really hasn't happened. And the productivity that you're mentioning, I can tell you with myself, it's the amount of work that I can get done with my tool set is tremendous now. And there's like a productivity juice that goes with it, right, Mike? You just like, you're cranking out good work, and it makes for long days.
I wonder where it all ends. I get a lot of calls from folks that work in the investment community. I won't mention them, and they're longtime friends, and so we talk a lot. And right in front of us, the economy that we used to know is being repriced. And so you and I used to participate, and most of us had work in the friction economy. And that friction economy was the service economy. And because of the power of these tools, the friction economy is being repriced right in front of us. You're seeing the same power that enterprises and people used to pay for services being drastically repriced, probably eventually to near zero because of the power of these tools.
Yeah. Yeah.
It won't happen overnight, but it won't take long.
Yeah. It'll happen faster than what people think. So let's talk about it, Mike, the enterprise perspective. I love the perspective that you have, the work that you do around industrial ops companies. I've just always loved that generally. You're able to see the work of work, right, Mike? It's like the grit work of work that happens in industrial ops that just, it's almost like no denying it. I love the tangible idea of it. So when you think about the way that agentic AI is changing, I want to say, control of those businesses operationally. What are you seeing, Mike? Like, what do you think leaders are anticipating? What do you think they haven't put together yet in terms of what this is going to mean, to the operational capabilities of the business now and going forward?
I think control in their minds used to be governance, right? They used to say it's in motion. How can I apply something that puts restraint to it, right? That gives me some sense of control that feels a whole lot like I'm trying to slow it down so I feel like I have control over something that we call governance. And today what they're finding out is that those mechanisms are insufficient. They're insufficient because the landscape that they're all on is so dynamic that they're reacting to the externalities and needing to react in a way that they can't keep up with the decisions fast enough that any amount of control that they would exercise feels sufficient. And bound up in and so you and I have these conversations about the way companies are built. And so what happened was that every time that we needed to apply governance, what happened was that the organization became more fragmented. And that fragmentation was built around expertise. And it was expertise to deliver insights where we needed the application of those insights for the exercise of governance, right? And in a certain area, and that felt like control. But today, what happened was that fragmentation has built this staircase of permission inside organizations when you need to exercise decisions to keep pace with a changing landscape for which the technology has created this closeness that everybody sees what's going on. It's no longer opacity except for the decisions, right? The gated decisions that are part of the staircase. That's where opacity happens. And so now the architecture from the 50s is back here saying, wait. But the landscape and the customer saying, no, 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 no. If you're going to be competitive, you need to make these decisions faster. Because if you kind of come back and you talked about operations, when we had lots of deep tenure, most folks innately knew, right, what to go do because they had this long history of experience that they'd seen things once or twice or three times in their 20 to 30 years that they could forecast what might happen when they saw these conditions, and they can make all them subtle adjustments that kept it from happening again, right? And that doesn't exist today. So I was inside a plant this last week where the end of the back end of the plant, the chief job took 35 years to get in that seat. You know how many years of experience the people sitting in it today have?
3.
5.
So Mike, this idea that you're describing, right, is And I think that the businesses that you work with are similar to the businesses that I work with, even if they're not in the same industry. I think sometimes they are, but nevertheless, they've got big legacy environments, big legacy architectures, right, Mike? Well, first of all, like, executives were never good about architecture.
No.
They just were good about understanding architecture, even in those environments, which is why we had, a lot of technical debt. I mean, technical debt was in those environments, logic that was irrationalized, silos that fragmented decisions. And the only reason that you didn't see, how ineffective it was because the decisions never connected. You didn't really have to reconcile it because the silos were so deeply instantiated, right, Mike? So, I have my piece and he has his piece and she has her piece, whatever. And the underlying architecture from a business logic perspective, you wouldn't say was strong. You wouldn't say that was generally reliable, right? So I think you take something like architecture that business leaders were never comfortable in understanding the logical side of how business systems worked, in my opinion, the logical side of that. And then you combine that with governance that was always a policy idea after the fact, right, Mike? And you had time for people to be making the decisions as the gate. The gate was people. And so we used to have language for it, right? First gate, second gate, third gate, production.
Mitigated risk, right? It was a risk model. What you're describing is the architecture that was built for a company. That was the risk model that we used in order to manage a company, right? Because a company is a governance engine, right? And that's what you're describing.
Exactly. And so the pace of it never really outpaced, the pace of human intervention, right, Mike? Not in most catastrophic circumstances. In most circumstances that would rise to that level of risk, people could intervene. Qualified, seasoned people, Mike. It goes to your, how often did it take people to get into that role in order to be able to orchestrate complex tribal knowledge and tribal work practices, right? But they could do it, and they were reliable most of the time. When they weren't, it was terrible, but most of the time it worked. And now we think about governance structures that try to impose the same type of now latent control mechanisms, right, Mike? That's the problem, is that they're so latent, from the action. The risk is the action happened way upstream in the system, and the policy oversight happens downstream. And you'd be lucky if you saw it one problem, one issue at a time, right, Mike? Like you wouldn't see it until it built into some kind of material pattern, right?
It was really the mismatch. And so when you think about what technology enables, right, and it's collapsed that distance, right? If you remember the manila folders that had everybody's name on them, right, that sent all this stuff around, and these internal communications, that was the legacy. Even when we had email, those things existed. You remember? You still passed those things around and you had email. It's like inter-office communication through those manila folders persisted for 10 years after email?
Look, sometimes you still see it today,
Yeah.
Mike. You still see it today on the front line in energy companies and other, other workflow that literally passes, work packets, important ideas of work packets around the organization for whatever. Sequential work, signature, I don't care, whatever it is.
Some type of validation, right? And so the organization was built with that construction that persisted, even though technology collapsed the distance between signal and action, right? And so now that's collapsed, what happens is, if you think about what the front line really wants to do, so let's go back to that 5-year employee, right? And he doesn't possess the innate earned, when I say earned, the the scars of having done it wrong for so long with all the experience, right? He's got 5 years, doesn't make him bad. It just makes him inexperienced. And and so how's he operate? Well, what he really wants is, what do I need to know? What do I need to do with it? When do I need to do it? And because he has 5 years of experience, he's asking, do I have the permission to do it? Right? And the way he gets that now is he has to go back to the staircase. That staircase involves his supervisor. It involves the fragmentary nature of the organization. Does process control organization are they going to allow me to do it? Is the maintenance organization going to allow me to make the change I need to make? So you have all these people that have to weigh in, right, relative to what I'm seeing, and do I have the permission to actually go act if it's outside what my normal authority would be, because we've lost all this tenure. And so what happened in the world was that we built an operating model around an understanding that we had employable people that stayed in a company for that period of time, and that engagement model required them to have that amount of tenure in order to be successful, right? And then all of a sudden that eroded out from beneath us, right? And so you would say that since 1975, the amount of people that have 20 years or more experience has declined by about half, about 50%, right? The amount of things that they look over, because of the way we decided to deploy capital through marginal contribution analysis. And I'm not saying it was wrong. It's just the way we thought about it was, let's add this incremental thing here to make it a little better. Let's add this device here to make it just a little faster. So these incremental improvements over time has gave them about 50% more things to look at in that same role. So every role over major assets, right, now they have more things to look at in the same role. So it's 50% fewer people with deep tenure, 50% more things to look at. And then along comes our ability to collect all the data from all that stuff that we've added, right? And now we pile that in front of them, thinking that if I give you more information, you make better decisions. Well, if that's true, I'm just going to give you more information to make better decisions. And now they have more than 8 times more things to look at than they ever have across 50% more things. And now we wonder why productivities went down. It's because we've reached a cognitive threshold of people with less experience that can make good decisions in order to run the equipment for which they have less experience about.
So freeze frame right there for a second, Mike, because I think this is a fascinating, juncture. So right where that strategic workforce situation or gap is, agentic AI comes in. So what does agentic AI do, and at what risk, Mike, to the strategic workforce problem that we find ourselves in the middle of? This is part of the reason why we're saying that we're not going to necessarily lose jobs, if you will, right? Especially in industrial operation companies. But this issue of, how does agentic AI solve that problem and complicate that problem at the same time, Mike?
So I think what agentic AI really does, right? And so let's go to where we have been, right? Let's go to the insight generation pool. That would be generation 1 technology, or AI, right? Which is all the data science work and all the insights that were delivered. And so when we delivered those insights to those individuals, what do they have to do? Right? They had a dashboard with a bunch of stuff on it, and multiple dashboards. They had to drill down, figure out why. And the inferencing load and the burden was piled back on the individual, and they had to bring their own logic to the interpretation of everything, right? And so with that, there was a lot of training, a lot of understanding had to come with those insights. And then once they brought all that inferencing load, then the next thing they had to do was they had to figure out, all right, now I know I have to make a decision. And once I make that decision, I have to figure out, do I have permission to go do that? Right? In order to take that action that shapes that outcome, that creates that value, right? What Agentic does is Agentic gets you all the way to, this is the decision you need to make, right? This is when you need to make it. And this is the permission you have because it's within guardrails. And you would ask, why has permission come along with it? So let's go back to what the organization is today and why it's so slow, right? What the organization is today is it's an explanation machine. So in every bit of the organization, what we have is all these alignment meetings. And those alignment meetings are really a negotiation about legitimacy. Whose explanation carries the most weight that decides how we want to share or place responsibility for the decision that is made. So we're all in agreement that this is the explanation or the explainable reasons as to, right? As to why and who's going, and we're going to share that responsibility, by the way, as to why we're going to go do these things that makes it the most explainable to the organization, right? And so what they're really doing is they're actually sharing accountability through the meeting, even though somebody in the meeting or some bodies in a meeting whose social security numbers, where's the ultimate accountability, right? In the meeting, they actually share the responsibility of having come up with the reasoning. So there's this sharing of responsibility. But what Agentic does, Agentic gets rid of the explainable piece, right? And there's a thing called causal that I talk about a lot, right? And so what causal is this understanding that you take the things that you know are true in any situation, and they're definable. They're a set of truths. You take the things that you do to make things true, right? So the principles that you know are true, the things you do to make things true, and then you develop a hypothesis. We do this every day in our lives when we try and create agency for ourselves, right? And so every time we want to shape an outcome, right, we figure out what we understand about the situation from a principle perspective. What things can we go do that are the interventions that might shape that to our benefit? And then we do what if, which is the counterfactuals, and we decide when we want to go do it, and we go take an action, and then we evaluate the evidence, which is the observable piece of what happened, and we learn from that, and we iterate that for the next time we go do it. And so in causal, you do the same thing. You take the things that are true about that situation that you're in charge of, the things that you can go do that are true about what you would do, right? You form that hypothesis, you do counterfactuals, and you develop it, and you say, what evidence is needed for me to know that I done well or didn't do well? And that's causality.
So what you're saying, Mike, is when we think about, this is another way of describing governance. It's kind of a how description of governance, right?
It's the guardrails, right? But exactly. That is a chain of reasoning, right? That's why permission is enabled, because within that governance, right? Governance is now a learning loop that is tied to guardrails of what is permissible, not a gate. Right. So as long as you follow this guardrail, it is permissible because you have an auditable chain of reasoning as to why it was done. It is not a litigated, it's not a litigated explanation. So now it's legitimacy. Right. So you have a legitimate reason for taking that action, which is the problem in organizations today. Is the reason we have alignment meetings is to build legitimacy for action.
Right. So, what we're saying, right, Mike, is that so causality then ends up being a structural capability, and it sits inside the enterprise system. It is, in a lot of ways, the enterprise system of thresholds, permissions. It creates agency. It creates agency. And when that gets out of whack, right, Mike? And I think that it would happen when businesses are deploying AI solutions and not thinking ahead of time about how this causal control is really going to work, right? And it doesn't look evidently necessarily broken every day, but the aggregate of the decisions that are starting to happen across the business become less and less, transparent or apparent, right, Mike? And then we start seeing these outcomes that we didn't expect. Hard to explain, hard to figure out at what point we lost it, but at some point we lost it, and this whole idea of explainability becomes an Easter egg hunt,
So let's talk about how it gets out of whack, right? And so there's a lot of companies out there that are saying to themselves, I want to go deploy Gen AI. Right? And I want to deploy Gen AI because it creates speed. The truth is, it absolutely does. It absolutely creates speed. And so now what happens is you have a fluency engine that is built on top of a bunch of documents that are explanations of how you wanted to define yourself, right? And so now you have all this speed built in that is a vector math engine that is not a causal engine. It is not a chain of reasoning. It is just an explanation that is the sum of vector math that is 75% accurate on what it tells you wanted to know about. And then the next time you ask, and the more you pile on top of it, the less accurate it gets. And it's a speed enabler. It is not an accuracy enabler.
No doubt. Matter of fact, what you'd probably say, to the surprise, I think, Mike, of some leaders, is that the agentic enterprise is not likely to break based on accuracy outcomes, right, Mike, that you could observe, which includes it's not likely to break based on data that you have or don't have, or intent that you have or don't have. But it is likely to break based on something that looks like, coherence, right, Mike?
It's absolute coherence. It will not break. It will not break on data, right? Because your data is not the asset.
I know but look at all the
or the
investments being
asset,
made.
right?
Yes.
And I think so. Let's do a little thought exercise for a second, right? Let's assume for a second that you're an executive, right? And the board offers you options. Do you accept them or turn them down?
You accept them.
Do you exercise them the very second you get them?
You do not.
You do not. Well, you could, I guess, but most.
I guess.
So now, for most of what you and I remember as the data science world, right? Where we've been collecting all this data. So if you put a y-axis that is variables and an x-axis that is data, we know that line has been going up and to the right forever. We've been collecting more variables, right, and more data behind that stuff forever, which means that we've been putting more power, more science behind it, and now we've had to hire outside people to come tell us what the insights are, and just do more frequency math. Right? What the world quickly becomes is, what if you understood in the future what variables mattered and what data mattered relative to those variables? That was the evidence that you needed for validation, and into subscription for those options in the future that you needed to understand for buying those options was causality, because that's what causality buys you. Causality buys you the ability to say, these are the variables that matter in the future decisions I need to make as optionality, and this is the data I need relative to those options in the future that's going to be important for the evidence that supports the understanding that my hypothesis was right. You don't need all those variables and all that data anymore. You just need the ones that matter. And that's what causality buys you, is you're really buying options on the future for which the subscription is causality.
It's such a different approach, right, Mike, in terms of the data strategy that you would be running if you were responsible for that as an organization, in terms of, what you think you need to be able to reason through the enterprise options and decisions that are likely to face you in the future. It's a different question, I think, than what gets asked today relative to, what data do I need, right?
Yeah, there's a simple thought exercise that sometimes you can go through, right? And that thought exercise, if you take anything that you're doing, and so for instance, right, from a psychological perspective, you're the best HR person I know, so we're going to use confidence as the topic, right? What a lot of people want to do is they say, in order for me to have good confidence, I want these things to be true. So if I stack up all the things that make confidence true, right, for me, it might be whatever makes confidence true as symptoms, right? So confidence would have these things,
These ideas associated with
ideas
right.
associated with having good confidence, and they're manifestations of what you see people behave like when they have good confidence. They have the right kind of posture, right? They have the right kind of behavior. They say the right words, right? And so all these things are associated with confidence, right? The issue with them is that they are consequences and manifestations of confidence in themselves. They're not the causes of good confidence.
Yeah.
And so what we all try and do is we try to stack up symptoms. We do this in our operations. We try to stack up getting the symptoms right, not working on the causes of confidence.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like synonymous with this idea of confidence as demonstrated behaviors, right, Mike? Like what you're saying. It's confidence as demonstrated behaviors, but demonstrated behaviors don't map directly to intent. You know what I mean, or purpose or any other, idea of, what caused those behaviors to be routine.
And so one of the ways you would think about it is that, let's say, for instance, that I have productivity decline in my company, which means that productivity is creating disadvantage for me, right? And one of those symptoms, or a few of those symptoms that I would see if I have productivity disadvantage, is that I would have weakening margin, right? I would have quality excursions. I would have misinvestment in capital, right? I would have more unplanned downtime. Well, how often do we go work on those things? Because those are symptoms of declining productivity or creating disadvantage with productivity. When in fact declining productivity is actually the consequence of not having the effective controls in place on the landscape that you're trying to create the enterprise operation on, that's creating the operational conditions causing productivity decline.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, Mike, I think you're making a great point. And I'm so interested in, how you see that go down, because to me, what I see in terms of why that doesn't get addressed more directly is because those issues are horizontal. Those issues defy the structure of the business if you really want to understand them, because they don't manifest to the impact that you're describing, I think, most of the time vertically. I think they manifest horizontally. They're cross-functional, they're cross-enterprise, they're cross-system, and there's something about being able to connect those dots that you've got to connect them across the chasm, across the ecosystem to really understand the full impact of what's going on.
So
Your
let's
thoughts?
go back to the question you asked me about what does Agentic do, right? Agentic, if we let it, solves all those problems. So think about Agentic this way, right? In the same way that you create agency for yourself, right? You take what you know to be true. You take the things that you can do to make things true. You form a hypothesis between those two, and you decide a course of action to shape an outcome. You observe the evidence of that result, right? And you learn from it, right? In the world that we are in, this technology, it exists today, right? We just don't apply it the way we should apply it. All right, we're stuck in this. I want the insight. I want to make these decisions myself. I want to do the inferencing myself. I want to do all this stuff myself, right? Because we'll let loose of that for our own benefit, right? If we describe, and this is where Gen AI comes in, if we describe what is true about ourselves as a company, what's our intent, what's our purpose, what's true, right? How we serve customers, what are we in business to do, and then we take what we do to make things true, right? What processes do we have? What's special about us in the way we get things done, the way our employees engage? All if we describe those things, and they're all described, they're in our companies today. All that knowledge actually exists in our company today. It's not like it's a secret or anything. It actually exists in the company. So now you got the same things in our company. It's called enterprise agency, right? It actually exists in our company in human form, in written form, in documents, all exists today. And then the next thing we do is we take and we create this durable core of software that connects the things that we can describe, right? About what's true and what we do to make true, to the ability to basically execute at any edge in any surface that's controllable in our enterprise, wherever work gets done. Now what's work? Work is whether it's intellectual, right, and making a decision, or actually doing things that is manual labor or intellectual labor, right? Any surface that we're trying to shape on the enterprise, right? That's the edge. And so that durable core actually uses the edge with an agent and writes its own applications to get that done. And when it doesn't need them anymore, it disposes of them. So the idea that at the edge, software is disposable, attached to the durable core, right? That makes this true. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. So I just want to feed that back to you. So what you're saying, just in response to, us trying to understand the difference between the readiness of enterprises, today, because it's a readiness issue, Mike, right? Versus the capabilities that are possible. You're saying it's possible today in agentic AI to solve, if we can structure, our infrastructure and architecture correctly, business level, because that's what it is, right? So now we're in like two areas that leaders, I think, are really uncomfortable about, but it's an architecture and infrastructure idea. And if we can structure those, around the flow of decision making, it's like a decision making flow, that's truly productive for the business. It asks the right questions. It anticipates the right set of circumstances and conditions. It understands, how to define threshold. It gives agency as a byproduct. It gives natural agency as a byproduct, and the outcomes then are discoverable and, et cetera. Go ahead.
And I think people get worried that they're going to be replaced because what these things do is they basically close the gap that used to be difficult for us, which is all the orchestration that went into creating that and reducing that friction that went into all the inferencing to decision, right? And now the agent is taking care of all that wonderful thinking that we used to do. We're actually auditing that, right? Because we're the developers that, and we're responsible. So think about it this way, right?
But do you think that's a barrier, Mike? I just want to ask you a question on what you said. Do you think that the barrier is that people are afraid about, the power of this or being displaced by this? I mean, do you see that? Oh, you do.
I think they're worried about the notion that there are things that they used to do that they won't do, without understanding there are things they have done personally, right, for their own work that they need to do for when a machine does it. And that's the audit of the reasoning, right? They're used to auditing their own reasoning.
Yeah. What they don't see, Mike, what you're saying is what they don't see is their to-be value proposition. They're unclear about their to-be value prop in that state, in that future state where all those inner workings get solved. And it feels like, what gets solved is that, I'm not needed.
So here's the really sticky part. The really sticky part in all this is that when machines make the decision, are you going to be willing to wear the accountability if you don't get the audit, the chain of reasoning?
Yeah.
And
is it an audit idea, Mike, or is it a different context of oversight and orchestration?
And transparency. And I think we'll have to figure this out, right? So
Yeah.
ask yourself this as an individual, and this is to all people that we're talking to. If you're going to be accountable, which means you're responsible, and a machine makes the decision, because agents shape outcomes through decisions, right? And you wear that responsibility. Will you blindly let that decision happen without you having the authority to approve it and or audit it, or say, no, that's the wrong decision? And as a society, as people, I mean, these things will be true not only for our enterprises, it'll be true for us as individuals too, right? Because the orchestration of getting things in position to get what we want will become easy. That used to be hard because we spent all our lives trying to orchestrate things that we wanted. And now that stuff becomes really, really easy. And what we want now becomes hard because we have to ask, why did I want what I want? And we get more time to think about it. Hopefully we get more time to think about it. If you're like me, I use these tools to do a lot more work. And my wife asked me, aren't you done? And
I know. Exactly.
And
Well, can I ask you something, just as I know you think about this a lot? I'm sorry to jump in on this, but
I don't know all the answers to this. I like these conversations.
It's fascinating to me, especially, in this idea of solving these, operational enterprise issues. And if I just took one of them and said, in a macro sense, solving operational latency. But like, what happens when it goes up to the level that you're saying? It's not just accountability for the system, but it's accountability, on top of the system. When we're thinking about, how leaders might use, latency or other, decision-making patterns to check, ethical decisions, to check other strategic decisions. They sit at a higher level, right, Mike, than operational throughput, latency, and the completion of operational work. And some of these, latency ideas go into this, time to think, to question whether or not any of this is rising to a higher level of concern. What you're thinking about that generally? Like, when does it tip into moral issues? When does it tip into ethical issues? And it's not just, can we run the business without making huge mistakes?
I think there are some times when decision latency is necessary, and
Yeah.
safety is one of them, right? And compliance is another one with regard to regulations. I think we're going to have to work through that speed for speed's sake. And we had that conversation with Gen AI, right? Speed for speed's sake is probably unwise. Having
Yeah.
an audible chain of reasoning with a decision packet, all that stuff would be in a decision packet as a part of the process is necessary, but we're going to have some rules that we live by, right?
Yeah.
And so, this stuff will be used in all aspects of our lives. And let's project forward to education for a second, right? So imagine you're sitting at home for a second, right? And your granddaughter's over, and she's got her laptop with her, and she's doing her homework, and you see this look on her face. It looks a little quizzled, right? And you go, "What's wrong, honey?" And she says, "It's telling me that I'm behind and I'm slow." I think we have to be really careful.
Yeah, I do too.
And I think one of those things we have to be careful about is we should be really careful with a machine putting labels on any human. We should not let a machine label anybody, whether at work, in school, or anything else.
Recruiting purposes, Mike. I mean, we've seen terrible ideas of that, right?
Absolutely. And we have to be really, really careful. The power of these things is phenomenal to help us. We just need to resist the temptation to not be human.
How do you think that gets factored, Mike, in the infrastructure of the solution, literally? How do you think that works its way, into the same system by which these decisions, kind of either get made or at least get impacted or influenced?
That's going to be interesting. You would like to say that along with that comes some guiding principles, let's say.
Yeah.
Right. And those guiding principles help set the boundaries through which we all understand how this should behave. Maybe it will help us with wisdom, temperance, fortitude, and justice, right? And maybe we get back to the 4 chief virtues that were talked about thousands of years ago when people tried to decide what did it mean to be human. And maybe this frees us up for that we start to discover that wisdom is the ability to understand why your mistakes are your mistakes, and temperance is the ability to listen to other people, and fortitude is to have enough forbearance to not want to rush off to all the things that you would like to get to soon enough, and justice is the ability to be fair to everyone.
Virtue system, Mike. Where's virtue?
Well, those are 4 virtues, right?
Right.
And
Right.
I know I haven't got them all right, but I think that in this effort, well, you and I both work in this really large online community, and you and I both say the same thing to it whenever we're talking to this online community, is that sometimes we'll see people come into the community and make comments, and you and I both share the same opinion about it, is that we're not trying to be right, we're trying to get this right. And it is really, really difficult to not try and be right, right? And to try and bring a community together. And it's to ask better questions, because I think in all this, we've not lived in this world before. And because we've not lived in this world before, to think that we understand it is a bit of hubris. Maybe it's a whole lot of hubris.
Yeah.
Um,
Mike, just to kind of put an explanation point on that, it's not surprising, right, that when we talk about, architecture was underappreciated and maybe misunderstood, just like, the idea of enterprise infrastructure concepts, as horizontals across the business. But I tell you, the one that we never got right, and now there's a big flashlight on it, is we never got knowledge right, Mike.
No.
We never got knowledge right.
We never got it right.
We never did. And we spent a bunch of money on it. Like, we spent a ton of money on enterprise knowledge management, right? That turned out to be terrible ideas of what was human know-how. And how do we capture it and store it, God forbid, and share it? So in a lot of ways, we're back in, those same conundrums, asking the question with a different set of tools, but the human knowledge challenge is still the same.
I think that I think you're right. I think us thinking that we know the answers many times gets the better of us. It's like this. The technology exists today to do everything that we need to go do. The limitation is our ability to apply it. And it is it's not been a it's not been, when you look at the response to the market lately, you would say the market lately is a response to the value that's manifesting itself in the application of those technologies. And that repricing is an understanding that whatever's next may be better. And that it probably is.
Yeah. Yeah. We could have a different discussion about, what that means in terms of some of these divides, right? Some of the byproducts of lack of equity in terms of agency and access, and what it means as we think about these ethical ideas of the definition of the disadvantaged, right?
So you make me, every time I talk to you, you make me think, and as you think about the architecture of companies, what I continue to try and understand is what becomes of the architecture of companies. You could argue that the top layer stays the same, and the middle gets hollowed out, and there's this front line really doesn't change much. Supervisors are all still there. That all stays the same, but the middle gets hollowed out a lot. I'm not certain what happens.
Yeah. I don't know either. I think that, it's amazing to me how resilient these hierarchies are. It hasn't worked for quite a while, Mike, in different circumstances. And it's all, still there. So whether the middle layer, ends up, becoming a different kind of glue, than, the interpreter, the coordinator, the overseer, I think, remains to be seen. So I'm uncertain about that. I feel more confident in the very valuable idea of orchestration at different layers. I think that there is a definition of, orchestration that becomes almost like the new social enterprise, relationship to relationship, give and take, how that gets organized, how it gets orchestrated, as the important idea, of people to people, people to resources, people to other digital actors, et cetera, just puts us all in this, role of orchestration that applies to the front line, Mike. I think it applies to top level leadership, this idea of looking left and looking right on behalf of myself and others as people, as to the business itself. I just think that hopefully there's a strengthening of the communities within the enterprises, within our enterprises that, value and give time, for people to be relating to other people in the ecosystem, not necessarily the people that look most like me, but people that look less like me. I think that better decisions happen when we do that. I hope we see that cross-functional pollination of ideas and unshackling people from being limited, to dealing with a group of peers who are only like them, and letting them and encouraging them to be dealing, with people who aren't like them across the enterprise. I hope that happens.
So let's test something for a second then, because I think you're right. If you were to say the internet democratized information and that the advent of kind of the cloud democratized the ability to bring data science for better insights and gathering of information, we're on the cusp of what would be true today, is that we're about to democratize logic and commoditize reasoning. And if that's true, right? And if in the past that when we deployed ERPs, we built an entire ecosystem of people that were there to support the transactional engine, which was an ERP, right? And so large organizations were built around supporting that. And if it is also true, then that the organization becomes this support of what's true about you, what you do to make things true about you, which is the large middle portion of the organization, right? Is that's where most of that knowledge is contained. And if the transactional engine just becomes kind of this repository, I think what happens is that most of the middle part of the organization probably looks like a support for the commoditization of reasoning, in the same way that we had a large part of the organization become support for the transactional engine, right? That the reasoning engine needs support in the same way, because that reasoning engine is the things that are what you do to make things true, right? I don't think you can get rid of the support of the reasoning engine of the organization built around what's true about you, right? All supported by the durable core that uses that in order to write applications at the edge that it disposes of when the context changes.
That makes, not only does it make sense to me, I can totally see that. I think that if it creates the opportunity to reskill, retrain, offer, future career opportunities outside of the transactional layer, that would be great, right? Like, that would be great, because, that's just, the early systems, of our enterprises that had people still doing tremendous labor work, so replacing that, I think, in my opinion, would be great. I think what we have to get right is agency, right? Going forward, the government agency.
That's enterprise agency. And so you called it something, and it's slipped my mind, that when you go from one level of work to the next level of work, these folks will be going from one level of work to a different level of work, where they're these monitors of reasoning, right? They're the proctors of reasoning in the organization, because they're the ones that not only audit it and understand it, they're also the ones that support it and develop the improvement of it.
Right, right. I love it too, because besides hopefully the elimination of, transactional work or other work that's unsafe, as we were talking about a moment ago, et cetera, I also think it's an opportunity for people who have been doing the work of work and really understand what makes the business work. What makes it work? Why does it fail when it fails? I mean, the people that know that are the people that are closest to the execution of the work, and I think that if we did this fairly and correctly and for scalability in the future, we would find that work becomes more valuable to the organization. What looks like a commodity idea when you sit far away from it, under recognizes the tremendous idea of human ingenuity that's really informing a lot of that work, safeguarding us from bigger issues than, look, you don't know something if you avoided it, right, Mike? If we all avoided it, you don't necessarily appreciate, how it was avoided. So I'm hopeful of that. And I think that, to your point, just to close the loop, if we think about it really is a governance of agency going forward, maybe that's the connecting the dots, Mike, that's needed, to be the anchor on both the operational side and on the ethical side, because you can connect those dots through agency all day.
I think that's right, and it's going to be uncomfortable. Most of us, including I'm guilty myself, right? Avoid the uncomfortable pieces. The issue with avoiding the uncomfortable part of this right now is you probably become disadvantaged before you become advantaged in this world today. Not doing it soon enough means that you become in second place. And second place is so far from first place, you're not going to like that result.
I think that's a very big idea. So I feel like you'd have to think in the strategy of that, in the planning of that, there's this opportunity to do it right. And what you avoid is no unexpected steps backwards, Mike. You avoid the no steps backwards that you didn't anticipate, and that creates some, and maybe it's idealistic, but creates some momentum or speed that competes in the journey.
So there's this notion, and see how you react to this today, that most of the companies are out there trying to build this AI strategy. You probably need to think about your architecture before you ever do that. That you need to be an AI second company and figure out how you make decisions, where your inference burden is really high, where your permission burden is really high. Find out where those intersections are in your company, where both of them coexist at the same time. And once you understand what that architecture looks like, now you've figured out where artificial intelligence can actually help you.
That's exponential, Mike. I mean, that's exponential. I'll take it all the way back to what we said in the very beginning of the discussion when I was saying to you, I've been doing a lot of board work recently. Some of the just most terrible directions that I've seen across industry have come from boards who say to executives, go do something with AI. We'd like to hear about you doing something with AI. Come back and talk to us about that the next time. It's just a terrible direction, for the board to be saying, or the executive team to be saying, to the organization. And I honestly, besides terrible direction, I think that when they're told that, they don't even know what to do. They just go and start buying shit, you know?
It's an incomplete understanding of what AI is, right? In the technology.
Right. Look, I think any time spent in thinking about the relationship, Mike, of business architecture, because I think it is first business architecture. And again, we're going to have a whole separate discussion on this, but the idea of the to-be business architecture relative, which is just about up against the operating model, to your point earlier, relative to enterprise architecture, hand in glove ideas, you know. Go tell me what that even looks like in the current state. Go even tell me what it looks like in the current state, nevertheless, how you think it should change. And I think there's a discussion to be had. Mike, I always love talking to you because
we don't do it enough. You're awesome. Always are. Thank you so very much.